Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Orang Asli Health and Wellbeing webinar. It's great to have all of you here. As you come in, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, your affiliation, your field of work or study. And if you have any questions during this time, feel free to also type those in the chat box. So this is a 4-part webinar series. This webinar brings together scholars from a variety of backgrounds to address current challenges for Orang Asli health and well-being. We hope to foster informal and formal networks of discussion and collaboration for future basic and applied research. The ultimate goal is to improve health and well-being outcomes among the Orang Asli. Pardon me. So I want to start out by introducing the webinar co-organizers. That's myself. My name is Vivek Venkataraman. I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse in France, and I'll be starting as an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Calgary in Canada in 2021. Our second co-organizer is Thomas Kraft. He's a postdoctoral scholar in anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Tom and I have both done fieldwork in Malaysia, working with Batak hunter-gatherers in Pahang and Kelantan. And the third organizer is Rodney Obian. He's a college archivist and associate professor in information studies at Keene State College, which is playing host to the webinar. As you know, this is a 4-part series occurring at the same time every week in November. So today is November 3rd. We will also meet on November 10th, 17th, and 24th. And we'll stick to the same time each week, 7:45 to 10 p.m. Feel free to log in a little bit early to work out any kinks. And we won't necessarily stop exactly at 10 p.m. Either, so you can feel free to stick around and continue the discussion. These sessions will be recorded and posted on YouTube as well as an external website after each week's presentation. And as we move forward, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Tom, and Tom is going to talk about some of the webinar house rules to make sure that things go smoothly. Go ahead, Tom.
Hello, everyone. As Vivek said, my name is Tom Kraft. I'm an anthropologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I just want to give everyone a little bit of orientation about how things are going to work over Zoom. For some of you, this may be your first time. For some of you, you may already be exhausted by Zoom conferences at this point. But we will control the who can speak at a given time by muting folks. So we ask that you hold questions till the end of talks, at which point we'll have a mechanism for you to ask your questions. We ask that speakers please stick to their allotted time. We have a very full schedule, and Rodney will ring a bell when you exceed a certain time limit, just to give you a gentle reminder that you've reached the allotted time. And then as far as the question and answer goes, we hopefully will have a little bit of time right after the end of each talk, at which point we'll have time for, between 1 and 3 questions, something like that. And we ask that there's 2 ways you can ask a question or indicate that you'd like to ask a question. The first is to chat your question into the chat box in the middle of the screen. I'll have a little tutorial on how to do that in the next slide. And the second will be to use a feature that Zoom has called the raise hand, at which point the host will unmute you and will indicate that you can speak and ask your question verbally if you'd prefer to do that rather than typing it. And we just ask that you identify yourself so that everyone knows who it is that's speaking when you ask your question. If you have any problems, feel free to contact us. There's 2 email addresses here you can use. You can also contact us directly through Zoom with the chat box. And as people have done so far, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box as we go. Could you go to the next slide, please, Vivek? And so just to show you, so this is an interface that should look something like what you're seeing on Zoom now. You should have some kind of bubble that's labeled chat. So when I say enter your question to the chat box, you can click there to bring up a screen where you can type a question that we'll all see. Vivek, if you can just press a couple more times here. Down in the bottom left corner, if you want to make it so that you can speak when it comes time to ask a question, you can click the audio button to enable that. The button next to it will enable people to see your video. We do ask that you turn your video off during the talks to allow for smoother performance, use a little bit less bandwidth, which usually helps. And then finally, to access the chat feature, you should be able to click a button, the participants button, and underneath it, there's a feature with that looks like this hand symbol up here, which is labeled raise hand, and we'll be able to see that as hosts, and that's another way you can ask your question. Although I do encourage people to use the chat box to ask their question, and then the host will be able to do so. It'll probably run a bit more smoothly with this many folks. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So we'll start with our talks, and we actually have two sort of introductory talks by myself and by Rodney Obian. So I'm going to hand over the microphone now to Rodney. As I said, Rodney has generously offered to host this through Keene State. And for some of you, you may already know that there's an Orang Asli archive at Keene State that Rodney also helps to manage. And he's just going to give a very short talk now describing this. Rodney?
Sure.
I will unshare my screen here.
Okay.
All right. Go for it.
Okay. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. On behalf of Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire in the United States, I want to welcome you to the first ever Orang Asli Health and Wellbeing Conference. Again, my name is Rodney Obian. I am college archivist, and I curate the Orang Asli archive at Keene State College. It has been a sincere pleasure working with Vivek and Tom in organizing this unique conference. We started with this question, this idea: what if we organized an online conference on Orang Asli health and well-being? Would anyone come? Well, you are proof of that. I guess at last count, we have over 124 registered people from all over the world. And that's amazing. I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Csilla Rabinowitz, Dean of Mason Library, for her steadfast support of this conference, and a special thank you to the members of the Orang Asli Archive Advisory Committee, Drs. Kirk Endicott, Yogis Samarian, and Rosemary Giano. Thank you very much. I decided to keep my remarks very, very brief in consideration of time and in deference to the wonderful presentations we have planned tonight. So as Vivek said, I'm just going to give a very brief overview or introduction to the Orang Asli Archive. The Orang Asli Archive was established in 2000 to preserve and disseminate the history and culture of the Orang Asli for the Orang Asli and for the research community and advocates who support them. It was through a grant from the Werner Grand Foundation and the vision and work of Dr. Rosemary Giano of Keene State College, Dr. Adelaide Baer of Oregon State University, and a team of librarians at Keene State College that proved instrumental in founding this repository. The archive includes over 30 linear feet of research material, books, unpublished papers, photographic material, audiovisual material, and artifacts dating from the early 20th century to the present, and relating to the 19 to 28 indigenous groups that make up the Orang Asli. The holdings include a number of manuscript collections, among them the papers of noted researchers, Bangsen Ho of the Canadian Center for Folk Culture Studies in Canada, of course, Robert K. Denton, the University of Buffalo, Rosemary Giano, of course, of Keene State College, Adelaide Baer, Oregon State University, Kurt and Karen Endicott, Dartmouth College, and Duncan Holliday, formerly of University of Malaya, and Suichi Nagata, of the late Suichi Nagata from the University of Toronto. These manuscript materials dating from the 1950s to the present cover a wide range of subject matter from the environment, ethnobotany, hunting and gathering practices to linguistics, medicinal practices, and mythology. The archives also collects materials relating to the Gombak Hospital, which I know everyone is familiar with. The hospital established in 1957 by the British doctor Malcolm Bolton to provide medical care for the Orang Asli. The core of this collection consists of the papers and photographs of 3 former nurses, Catherine Henderson, Jennifer Karen Duguid, Joan Swift, and volunteer Dr. Robert Gilman, who I'm excited to say will be participating in the conference. This collection covers the years between 1960 and 1963 and offers a rich visual documentation of the doctors and nurses who worked at the hospital, and also a documentation of their patients, the Orang Asli patients. Archives also includes the documentary films such as Nomads of the Jungle, produced by Louis de Rochemont in 1948, and Magic in the Hills, produced by Ivan Polnan, I believe, and produced by the BBC in 1975. The largest expansion in the archives has been in the digital realm. Keene State College is committed to digitizing the photographic holdings of the Orang Asli archive and making those scan images accessible online. There are now over 3,000 digital images available on KS Commons, the college's digital repository. The long-term plan is to digitize more text documents, audiovisual materials, artifacts, and the digital archives could easily expand to encompass more than 10,000 digital documents and objects in the near future. The archives has collaborated with the Center for Orang Asli Concerns in Malaysia and the Repository and Workshop for Asiatic Intangible Heritage at Lund University in Sweden. And we are always open to new collaboration. And in this case tonight with Vivek and Tom and their organization, the Orang Asli Health and Lifeways Project. So again, welcome to you all. We hope you will come visit the Orang Asli archives in Keene, either online at commons.keene.edu/OAA or in person when you're able. So thank you, and hope you enjoy this conference, and I'll turn it over to you, Vivek.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'll be the first speaker. My talk will be rather short and really just serve as an introduction to the webinar and to today's speakers for anthropologists. So I actually pre-recorded this just in case I had any internet issues. So I'm going to share my screen now and play a video. Okay, here goes. Hello, everyone. The content that you will hear over the... Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, it cut out there briefly.
It goes
Vivek.
in and out.
I think
It's very quiet also.
try it again.
Okay, I'll try it again. Let me just... Sound issue. Okay. Hello, everyone. In this talk, I will be introducing the Orang Asli Health and Wellbeing webinar and setting the stage for the content that you will hear over the next 4 sessions throughout the month of November 2020. I begin by discussing the broader motivations and themes behind this initiative. Then I will briefly introduce our speaker list. The reason we are all here, of course, is to talk about the Orang Asli and their health and well-being. The Orang Asli are comprised of about 18 indigenous groups in Peninsular Malaysia. Today, with a population of about 250,000 individuals, the Orang Asli comprise about 1% of the total population of Peninsular Malaysia. As you can see in this figure, there are numerous Orang Asli ethno-linguistic groups in a relatively small area. Historically and into the present day, there is considerable variation within and between groups with respect to subsistence strategies, settlement patterns, material culture, and social organization. To contextualize how this cultural diversity was formed and subsequently maintained, we need to step back in time. On the right is a photo of Kuala Lumpur from the late 1800s, back when it was just a small village, a far cry from the booming metropolis that it is today. These are photographs of Orang Asli from roughly the same time period. It was also the time when the first systematic descriptions of the Orang Asli were written by colonial administrators and anthropologists. But even by then, the Orang Asli had been significantly influenced by contact with outsiders. For thousands of years, many Orang Asli took part in trade networks bringing hard-to-acquire goods from the deep rainforest, such as rattan, eaglewood, honey, and wildlife products, out to external markets. This forager-collector lifestyle continues to characterize some groups to this day. Despite the benefits of trade, the Orang Asli had to be cautious in how they interacted with outsiders. Slavery was a long-established institution in the indigenous states of the Malay Peninsula before British intervention in the late 19th century, and the Orang Asli were a prime target. During this time, the Orang Asli and their labor were viewed as little more than a natural resource to be exploited. This legacy of slave raiding is thought to have a lasting impact on Orang Asli's psychology and social life up until the present day. As the widely acknowledged masters of the forest, the Orang Asli were instrumental in defending Malaya from Japan during World War II, and later from communist insurgents during the period known as the Emergency. Yet it was also during this time period that the first large-scale efforts to settle the Orang Asli began, on the theory that they were vulnerable to enemy manipulation. In the years since, there has been consistent pressure to change the lives of Orang Asli to bring them within the sphere of the Malaysian nation-state. One of the defining themes has been to promote sedentization and the adoption of agriculture, regardless of whether they have any cultural experience with it. This photo is from Kuala Ko in Kelantan, showing the typical prefabricated wooden and concrete houses that are built for the Orang Asli. In parallel with these sedentization efforts, the rainforest environment that once blanketed the peninsula and that many Orang Asli groups rely upon has been steadily destroyed, threatening their livelihoods. Over the past 20 years, Malaysia has had one of the highest deforestation rates in the world, as shown by the orange and red colors on this map. The loss of the rainforest stems from the conversion of forest habitat into agricultural land and mines. Malaysia is rich in mineral and timber resources and has a climate that is hospitable to oil palm and rubber. These industries have contributed significantly to economic development in Malaysia, yet the Orang Asli have reaped few of the rewards. In light of drastic environmental changes to their ancestral lands and the pressure to sedentize, the Orang Asli face distinct challenges. The impacts of sedentization are well documented, not only among the Orang Asli, but also other indigenous groups around the world facing similar pressures. It should be noted that sedentization, at least in theory, can come with some benefits, including access to healthcare, schools, electricity, running water, and new economic opportunities. But it can also profoundly alter social life and health. Populations typically grow, sanitation issues arise, and diets are reduced in their diversity, often giving rise to issues like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. There are also social changes that can directly affect health, such as the rise of inequality between individuals and genders, as well as increased conflict. Many groups face what is called the double burden of disease, in which they face not only infectious diseases, but also chronic, non-communicable diseases. Importantly, all of these factors interact in complex ways and cannot be understood independent of one another. In other words, the biological is closely connected with the social elements of change. In sum, the diversity of Orang Asli culture in 2020 reflects a long history of interaction with outsiders, as well as the dual influences of traditional and modernized ways of life. And change seems to be happening now faster than ever. From this perspective, it seems that we are at a crossroads when it comes to Orang Asli health. This webinar is designed to try to better understand the situation facing the Orang Asli and hopefully to do something about it. We have two major questions we hope to address through a series of talks and discussions. First, what are the main factors influencing Orang Asli health and well-being in the 21st century? And second, how can integrative research improve Orang Asli health and well-being? This effort starts with the need to understand how environments have changed and are continuing to change, both with respect to the ecological and the social world. These changes clearly affect health outcomes, but they do so in a complex way that requires more information. In particular, to understand how environmental change impacts health, we need to understand the biology, culture, and behavior of the Orang Asli. From a genetic and developmental standpoint, as well as lifestyle changes that affect energy balance, such as diet and physical activity. As noted earlier, these factors extensively interact with each other and are embedded in particular cultural contexts. The rapid pace of change in Malaysia, along with the diversity of the Orang Asli, makes Malaysia an important system for studying how health, culture, and environmental change are all interconnected, with implications not only for the Orang Asli, but also for society more broadly. Our goal is to arrive at a more holistic vision of Orang Asli health by bringing together different disciplines, including anthropology, biology, medicine, and ecology. While academics often focus on single topics and study them in great detail, here we emphasize the need to understand the system as a whole. Accordingly, we've organized the webinar to highlight the work of scholars who can speak to each of these approaches. Today, during the first session, we will hear from 4 anthropologists who have done impressive, in-depth fieldwork with different Orang Asli groups, starting as far back as the mid-1960s. Their long-term perspectives shed light on how and why Orang Asli lifeways and health have changed over the decades. During the second session, we will hear from speakers on a variety of issues. We will first hear from a historian. Sandra Manicum will present a historical perspective on Orang Asli health in the broader context of the history of medicine in Malaysia. We will then hear from 2 geneticists. Maud Phipps will present her work on the population history of the Orang Asli, and Amanda Lee will discuss how genomic tools can be used to understand how Orang Asli respond to rapid lifestyle changes. To continue with that theme, biological anthropologist Ian Wallace will discuss non-communicable chronic disease risk among the Orang Asli. Andy Hickson will conclude the session with a talk about how the Orang Asli are adapting to the pervasive presence of roads across Malaysia. During the third session, we will hear different perspectives from researchers and activists about how the Orang Asli interact with their physical environments. We'll first hear from Yvonne Lim about tropical diseases among the Orang Asli. Colin Nicholas will then highlight the importance of land rights for maintaining good health and well-being. Next, Aya Kawai will present on aspects of health and sanitation among the Batek at Kuala Ko. Tekwin Lim will present research on human-elephant relations in Malaysia. Wong Pui Mei will present her perspectives on how conservation can serve the needs of both wildlife and people. And Jules Ong will discuss media issues in relation to the Orang Asli. During session 4, we will move on to talking about healthcare efforts for the Orang Asli. The modern history of Orang Asli healthcare begins in the colonial era with Dr. Malcolm Bolton in Gombak Hospital in the 1950s. Through a network of remote field stations accessible only by helicopter, they provided medical care to the Orang Asli to an extent that was unprecedented at the time. We're fortunate enough to be joined by a researcher and doctor, Robert Gilman, who worked at Gombak in the 1960s and will provide a personal perspective on what it was like to work at Gombak at that time. We will then hear from Dr. Zandis, who is currently the head of Gombak Hospital, which is now managed through the Ministry of Health. Dr. Zandis will highlight his team's current efforts to improve Orang Asli health and well-being in 2020. Next, we will hear from Dr. Stephen Chow about his efforts to provide healthcare to remote communities through a system of mobile health clinics, while also building capacity in local communities. In the final talk of session 4, Tom Kraft will present a new interdisciplinary research project called the Orang Asli Health and Lifeways Project. Tom will outline the vision of this project, which recognizes that to improve the health of the Orang Asli, we need to bring together people from different places, disciplines, and ways of thinking to work together. In sum, The goal of this webinar series is to develop a more holistic approach to Orang Asli health and well-being. We hope to foster formal and informal networks across disciplines, generations, and countries. Specifically, we would like to identify priorities for future research, to think about how we can use research to inform policy, and importantly, to build capacity and increase empowerment among the Orang Asli themselves. In concluding this talk, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. We are joined by 4 anthropologists who have conducted extensive ethnographic fieldwork in Malaysia: Kirk Endicott, Signe Howell, Geoffrey Benjamin, and Csilla Dallos. Before the webinar, we asked these researchers a series of questions about the populations that they work with. Among these questions are the following. What are the principal changes you've observed over time? What are the primary factors that underlie declines in health? And what factors may be unknown or underappreciated? And finally, how can notions of health and well-being from sociocultural anthropology inform research in biology and medicine? Thank you again, everyone, for joining the webinar, and we look forward to your participation.
Okay, thanks. So I'll stop screen sharing there. And our first speaker, if we're ready to move on, is going to be Kirk Endicott, talking about his work with the Batek in Kelantan. Kirk, are you ready to share your screen?
Let me unmute him and okay, Kirk, you should be able to speak now.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, we can hear you. So you can go ahead and share your screen now for your PowerPoint, if you're ready.
Okay. I clicked on it. And now I go, what, share?
Okay, that's popping up. So if you then hit the tab, that would make that into the presentation with the full screen.
I don't want a full screen. I want a half a screen, but now you are screen sharing. I'm not even seeing our group now.
Kirk, do you see your PowerPoint presentation on your own screen currently?
No, I haven't been able to open it ever since I signed on to this to this webcast. It opened previously to when I first opened my computer.
Okay, because we can see the PowerPoint, or at least the very top bar. It says Batek Health Talk.
Oh, okay.
So we can see that, and your
You
cursor
can
is now
see it.
over it, at least on our screen.
You can see it. I can't see what you're seeing, unfortunately.
Let's see, Kirk, could you yeah, actually, Kirk, could you email me your presentation, and I could play it on the screen, and you could just direct me to change the slide when you need. That would be another option.
I can do that, but I'm going to have to leave you.
Just real quick, Tom. So when you guys talked yesterday or before, when you share the screen, do you pick the specific window to be sharing?
Yes, that's correct.
There's usually an option.
It looks like he has it open on his computer, but for some reason, we're just seeing that small piece.
You're just seeing a small piece. I'm not seeing any of it. It's just ridiculous.
Kirk, you could try hitting the escape key on your keyboard.
Yeah.
Does that change what you see?
Nothing changed. Perhaps I should just go ahead with my talk. I'm sorry that you can't see the maps and things that I wanted to show.
Well, we're actually, I think, okay for time. Maybe we should just put another few minutes into trying to solve this.
Okay.
Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I think if he just emails me the presentation, I think Maud's suggestion is good. I think I can just play it and he can direct me to change the slides.
Okay. Yeah, Kirk, could you do that? That would probably just take a minute or two.
Okay, I'm gonna have to leave the Zoom. I honestly,
I think that's okay, Kirk. If you need to leave and then rejoin, it shouldn't be a problem.
Rejoin, yeah.
okay.
Tuck Po is suggesting pressing Alt Tab to change your screen. That could be something you could try.
That may also work, yes.
Yeah.
What's that?
If
You
you
press the Alt and then the Tab button on your keyboard.
I'm sorry, I'm completely out of my depth there. I'm gonna have to leave.
Okay, so I think what we should do is if you can just email that presentation to us, and then you can just sign back in.
I'll try, but I'm not even able to do anything on my computer now. I honestly don't know what's, wait a minute. Oh, there's, okay, there.
There it is.
Okay. Now I'll go into,
if you the
I'm
slideshow.
going to go to slideshow
Yep, and play from start, and I think we should be good.
and play from start. Okay. Let's see. I'm not seeing the
It's
play from start button.
it's right below your title, Batek Health Talk. The tab is slideshow.
Uh-huh.
Right under the title at the very top of the screen. It says slideshow, animation, slideshow, review. Yeah, there you go.
Oh yeah, there's slideshow.
So press that and then go to the left and do play from start.
Okay.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, guys. And thanks everyone for your help as we work through this.
Thanks, everybody. So shall I just continue leaving this on the screen and just start the talk?
That's perfect. Go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready now.
Okay.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm sorry about the technical problems. I'm not experienced at doing this. I just want to remind you that Batek are a linguistically distinct group of Orang Asli living on the Labir River watershed in southern Kelantan and the Tumbling River watershed in northern Pahang. This report is not based on intensive, systematic, long-term study focused specifically on Batek health and healthcare. However, it draws on to a lot of bits of information about Batek health that I obtained intermittently during my studies of the Batek economy, social organization, and religion during my anthropological fieldwork between 1971 and 2004. It also draws on Dr. Peter Schindler's findings from his visits to the Batek and other Orang Asli groups in Kelantan while he was serving as a doctor based at Gombak Hospital in 1975 and 6. We focus here on the 1970s when the upstream groups were living as nomadic hunter-gatherers and traders, and 1990 when they were beginning to settle down. In this map, you can see the general area utilized by the Batek in the 1970s. It includes all of the Taman Negara National Park and a large area of land north of the park. In Kelantan, there were about 300 Batek living in 3 general areas. As you look on the map, you'll see one was the upper Labir River area, which is just over to the right, and then the Orang River area, slightly to the left, and they from there ventured into the Relai River, but the Orang was their base. And finally, the middle Labir River around Post Orang, it included not just some of the Batek Dek, but also some semi-sedentary Mandrik and Batek Tank who had been there attempting to do farming for a few years. The environment in the 1970s was mostly primary rainforest. There were also a few old fruit orchards left by Malay villagers who were moved downstream during the emergency. The environment provided numerous wild plant and animal resources, and it also provided clean water sources. There were no roads into the interior at that time, and so access was basically by boat, although you could go in by foot, presumably, and helicopters occasionally. The economy differed slightly between Post Labir and the upriver areas. At Post Labir, groups had attempted to grow crops with assistance from the Department of Orang Asli Affairs staff, and they had been provided with some rations in between their harvests. In the Upper Labir and Aring, the people were nomadic foragers and traders of forest products, at that time mainly rattan, large and small diameters. In 1971 and 2, the government provided rations of cracked wheat and flour by airdrops at Post Labir and Post Aring to encourage the Batek to settle down and take up shifting agriculture. Some families did try to do that, but they were discouraged by a shortage of rations that they needed in between harvests and the obligation that Batek have to share their harvests with relatives who did not help grow the crops. So their harvest didn't last for very long. The economy of the upriver groups included gathering of wild vegetable foods, especially wild yams. Here's a typical group going out. Here's a woman digging wild yams you can see in the foreground. Hunting of arboreal game, especially monkeys. Here's a man shooting a blowpipe at a monkey. This is just one of the many animals that they were able to kill that way. It's a gibbon. And the other important factor in the economy was trade. And from trade, they obtained rice, flour, dried fish, and tobacco. The traders, Batek would bring the rattan down to the riversides at agreed upon meeting places. And then the Malay traders would come up by boat about once a month, and the Batek would build a raft and put the rattan on, and the traders would take that rattan downstream. The social organization of the upper river groups was based on the autonomous conjugal families, husband, wife, and children. Each family decided what to do and where to go, and there was no hierarchical political organization telling people what to do. The residential groups were temporary camps of 5 to 10 families, many of the members closely related. Housing was in lean-to shelters made from thatch. And here you see a typical camp. The houses arranged usually in a kind of group where you could see from one house to another, and conversations could go on between people in different houses. And the members of a camp were a group and thought of themselves as a group who cooperated and shared food with each other. And camps would move every 2 to 4 weeks when the resources in the nearby area were diminished. At that time, the families might decide to go in different directions. They could split into more than one camp or move as a camp as a whole, or individual families could join existing camps. And even when they were not moving camps, there was frequent temporary visiting between camps, so information was always being shared. During this period, there was minimal contact and interaction with outsiders. Mainly they had contact with the traders and the medical staff from the Department of Orang Asli Affairs. The health of the upriver Batek was affected by a number of health hazards emanating from the physical environment, including broken bones and sprains from falls, infections from accidental blade cuts, vegetation abrasion, cuts, scratches, and stabs, fungal skin infections, bites and stings from spiders, ants, and snakes, wounds from wild animal attacks, parasites such as roundworms, mosquito-borne diseases, mainly malaria, digestive problems, some of which were caused by people not fully processing some poisonous foods that they ate. And these diseases could have long-term or short-term effects, some serious, some minor, but sometimes leading to death. Other health hazards from outside sources included tobacco, which was smoked by everyone, even children, and sugar, which later would cause tooth decay. Occasionally, mini epidemics would sweep through these camps, usually ones which were introduced by outsiders. In 1975, the camp we were staying in was affected by a respiratory disease, perhaps flu, the symptoms being a cough, tight chest, fever and chills, headache, and general weakness. Most people were sick for only a few days and then recovered, but a few were sick for several weeks. Fortunately, there were no deaths that time around. Some of the people appeared to be immune, even spouses of some of the victims. And it originated from a Malay trader who was camped nearby, and everybody realized this. And the responses of the Batek were to move way up into the interior. They split into 3 different camps, and they also used folk cures, said spells, and used plant-based medicines. Another more serious epidemic swept through in 1979, which I learned about when I came back in '81. 8 adults in the Upper Labir died rapidly within 2 weeks. The major symptom, I was told, was bloody stools. The folk medicines were tried and did not help. Again, the probable cause was Malay traders who had come up into that area. The response of the people, again, was to move camp up into more isolated locations. And the Semang people are well known that for leaving a camp whenever somebody dies, and that's what happened. Typically, apparently, these epidemics would take this course. The members, all the members of a camp, or most of them, would get the disease, and those that recovered presumably had gained some immunity. Sometimes the disease might spread to other camps through intervisiting. In a few cases, communicable chronic diseases occurred, including TB and leprosy, also probably introduced by outsiders. The apparent course of life that we witnessed in the 1970s was that when babies were still quite young, they would get an attack of some disease, perhaps malaria or a respiratory disease or gastrointestinal infection or something like that. And some of the babies did not survive. Our records of childhood death are, they were apparently the death rate was quite high, but our records are incomplete. And we only have to say that the children that did survive a first serious illness did seem to have a good chance of growing to adulthood. But even so, adults of all ages could die unexpectedly. And this led to remarriages and step parentage that could be shown in their genealogies. But still, a few adults seem to live into their 60s and 70s. Surviving adults appeared healthy. They were physically fit, had little tooth decay, and generally were fertile. Well, the health advantages of isolated nomadic groups in the 1970s included that the camps were relatively hygienic, mainly because people moved before waste built up around the camp. They had an adequate and well-varied diet, meat, vegetable sources, and the upstream water sources were clean. They used the downstreams as toilets. They had fairly limited contact with infected outsiders. But the disadvantages included that the nomadic camps were a poor environment for recovery compared to settlements because of the lack of facilities, of medical care, of drugs, and so on. And many people were reluctant to visit the hospital, the rumah sakit, the sick house, due to the fear of catching diseases and discrimination, poor treatment that they sometimes received outside their usual environment. And also a lack of understanding of how medical care procedures had to take place, like taking pills over an extended period rather than taking them all at once. And two taboos that were connected with folk curing methods sometimes interfered with medical care. Well, during the 1970s, the government had established some healthcare facilities and methods. There were medical posts maintained at Post Labir and Post Aring, and anti-malarial workers came up the river and sprayed DDT on the houses at Post Labir and Post Aring in the early 70s. The medical posts were staffed by medically trained Orang Asli field staff, mostly from other ethnic groups, such as the Temiar, who came in on several months rotations, sometimes with their families. There was shortwave radio contact with Gombak Hospital. There were helicopter landing areas near the two posts, and there were occasional visits by doctors from Gombak Hospital by helicopter or boat. Dr. Schindler came up the Labir in 1975 and 1976. And here's a picture of him treating a patient in 1976. The problems with this healthcare system, however, were that the Batek on the Aring treated the medical field staff, members of other ethnic Orang Asli groups, so badly that they were very unhappy to be posted up there. The Batek even stole things from these medical field staff. And the result was that the department in the middle 70s decided to close Post Aring. So that only left a medical field site at Post Labir. Also, the knowledge and skill of the medical field staff was limited. The shortwave radios often didn't work, and there were few, if any, emergency helicopter visits. And I was told that this area was just too far from the hospital at Gombak to be a practical trip for an emergency evacuation. The nearest hospital was at Kuala Krai, which was a 1 to 3 days journey downstream by raft or by boat. So it wasn't very accessible. Going on to the decade between 1982 and 1990, major changes took place. Environmentally, the land outside the national park, Taman Negara, was logged off and turned into rubber and oil plantations. All of that white space above Taman Negara in the map was cleared and planted with oil palms and rubber trees. Here's a typical early stage plantation. You can see some of the oil palm trees in the foreground, and then a road, a part of a whole network of roads, and finally burning of old destroyed forest in the background. The Batek had no rights to live in that area. They had no jobs, or there were no resources for them inside. So they there wasn't one new resource, was that the number of small villages sprang up along this network of oil palm plantations, and some of these villages had shops, including one on the upper Aring River near the Batek settlement of Sungai Ko. So the Batek had to relocate, and the post-Labir people stayed where they were, and some Batek joined the Mandrik and Batek tent at the settlement near post-Labir at what was called Kampong Machang. But in the upper areas, the two groups on the upper Labir and Aring moved to the border of the national park and established semi-permanent settlements. And the upper Labir one is at what's now called Kuala Ko, and the Aring group settled near the upper Aring River and near the upper Ko River in a settlement now called Sungai Ko. And that's at the edge of the Aring Lima estate. A number of economic changes as well as continuities went on. The Kuala Ko people continued foraging and collecting trade goods, mostly resinous gaharu wood, in Taman Negara and remaining patches of forest outside the park. The Sungai Ko people also foraged for food and gaharu wood in and around Taman Negara. In general, the emphasis on trade increased relative to the use of wild resources. This is a picture from Sungai Ko of traders weighing and grading the gaharu wood that the group of Batek there had collected. And they were coming up this network of roads almost on a daily basis at some periods, bringing things like bread rolls, which the Batek desired, and in exchange for the gaharu wood and other products of the forest. The people also who were both at Upper Aring and the Upper Labir and had settled, started to plant some crops. Here's a few people planting some rice seed, and they also planted fruit trees, which had an effect later on as a permanent resource for their diet and for trade. All three settlements, then the Batek were concentrated in three settlements, and these also served as sedentary base camps for temporary work groups going out and gathering products from the forest for trade. Usually groups of men went out for a few days at a time, living in temporary work camps. The women usually stayed behind near or in the new settlements. The diet in the settlements was based on purchased rice in particular, also some dried fish, sugar, sweets, and some crops, fast growing things like tapioca roots and bananas. For protein, wild game and fish were still sought. Hunters still went out regularly, and wild fruits in season and honey also were gathered, but tubers were seldom of any interest. That's just hard work, digging tubers instead of trading for rice. Socially, the groups continued to be based on the conjugal autonomous families. Government appointed headmen gained a little bit of authority in interacting with the authorities, and the base camps became much larger. Instead of an area having 2 or 3 different camps, they now had one. Food sharing, however, and cooperation between families continued, but the general standard of living was quite low, and some people came to have more wealth, you might say. Some people had motorbikes, for example. There was still visiting between the 3 settlements was very frequent now that there were roads, and people went by motorbikes and cars and jumped into the traders' pickup trucks when they were going in and out. The population increased due to sedentary living and better health care, and there was much more frequent contact with outsiders, including traders, government officials, loggers, plantation workers, and Muslim missionaries, and others. The people now were living in more substantial houses. First, they began to build Malay-style raised houses of bamboo with thatch, and later some government agencies devoted to helping the poor built some houses of wood and also even concrete. So the health changes for the newly settled Batek included certain advantages, easier access to medical facilities, a better environment for recuperation and rehabilitation. But there were also disadvantages to settled Batek. One, they were more exposed to communicable diseases passed from outsiders to the Batek and Mandrik at the settlements, including TB and leprosy, which became quite obvious. Malaria became more common due to the stagnant water in the logged areas and the plantations. People, especially women, seemed to be less physically fit due to less exercise, and poor diet led to some obesity and serious tooth decay. Many older people had very few teeth left during this period. Malnutrition may have also reduced immunity and resistance to infections. And one serious hazard was that the plantations and mining that went on led to water contamination and poisons actually entering the water supply. Government health care continued. A medical post at Post Levere was retained, but no medical posts were at Sungai Ko or Kuala Ko. Some Batek were still being trained at Gombak as medical staff. And I also tried to encourage the doctor at the Chiku clinic near Gua Musang to visit the Sungai Ko settlement, which she did. And she also promised to include that group in her monthly round. She didn't even know that they existed before that. I also transported some seriously ill Batek from Sungai Ko and Post Levere to hospitals in Kuala Krai and Kota Baru. By then, the Batek were more willing to go to hospitals, although they still used traditional ritual curing, which sometimes included prohibitions on leaving the settlement for a period of time. There was one tragic case where a little boy died because he was not allowed to go out for medical care. Just a few updates. After 1990, a hospital was established near Post Levere. And a Japanese anthropologist, Shingu Odani, carried out a study of Batek health and demographic trends at the Post Levere village in 2009 to 2011. And he discovered that although the mortality rate among the Batek and Mandrik remained high, especially among children below 5 years of age, the population actually grew due to a very high fertility rate. During the study period, all Post Levere women, mothers, delivered their babies at the nearby hospital. In 2012, the Department of Orang Asli Affairs, now called the Department of Orang Asli Development, turned over the responsibility for Orang Asli healthcare to the Ministry of Health. But between May and June 2019, 16 Batek villagers at Kuala Krai died after having fever, swelling of throat, coughing, and difficulty breathing. Over 100 more were ill and received treatment. The apparent causes included malnutrition, poor medical care, severe water pollution from plantations and mines, and possibly an infectious disease. This was such a serious outbreak that it was reported in the national and international news media. Recently, my Malaysian anthropologist colleague Lai Tak Po informed me that Batek living along the Tumbling River in Pahang are now getting good care from health workers, and some women give birth in hospitals. So when the health care is good and available, the settled and semi-settled Batek seem to be better off now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very
Okay.
much, Kirk.
I'll be glad to answer questions afterwards. I'm sorry it ran so long.
Okay, I think we might have one just quick question from Ivan Tacey. Ivan, you can unmute yourself and ask a quick question.
Yeah, so that was great, Kirk. Thanks so much. It was really brilliant. This is kind of a question to all the Batek researchers, because there's several, Alice is here, Tukpo's here, Diana, Kirk, and maybe a couple more people. Well, it's obviously Kirk, Tom and Vivek too. But with the Bateks that I've been working with, there is still, amongst some people, a kind of reluctance to go to hospitals. So a bit similar to some of the things Kirk talked about. And I think that definitely has a negative impact on health. And it seems to be, particularly in certain villages, a kind of a real intense distrust of going to hospital. And also a kind of, in some places, that people are quite upset about the way they're treated in hospitals. Furthermore, amongst some of the groups I work with, people are very reluctant to accompany sick friends or members of family to the hospital. So it's quite a lonely experience going to hospital. I just wondered if anyone would like to comment if they had similar findings or anything. Okay, I can't turn on video, Tukpo, because we've got the screen share on.
Well, I can tell you that that attitude was very strong in the early period in the 1970s. People were really afraid to go to hospital. They had the experience of going and actually catching diseases in hospital from other sick people. And that was one of the reasons they didn't go. And then they didn't like to be out there where they were subject to discrimination and derogatory comments and so on in general from people outside. And it was very scary unless a person was really in a desperate situation. They just felt very uncomfortable in hospitals. I don't know about the Guamusang Hospital, but I worked a lot with the doctor and the head of the hospital in Kuala Krai to try to help them to understand how people of Orang Asli people needed to be treated to make them feel welcome at the hospital. And unfortunately, it would take a total re-education of the population to make Orang Asli feel comfortable going to hospital. But I think that there was progress made. I don't know how it is now, but people were a little more willing to go in the 1990 period and in 2004 when I went back briefly.
Okay, thanks for that. That's a really good question, Ivan, of course. And I hope we can continue to talk about that during the webinar. We should move on with the next talk, though. So our next speaker is Signe Howell. Signe, are you ready to share your screen with us?
I'll mute, yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So is it 20 minutes that I have?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And in fact, listening to Kirk and looking at his photos, very, very similar to the situation among the Chewong. And you know, they look very similar also, at least because you didn't have the very negroid photos with you today, Kirk. But so much is similar between the Bartek and the Chewong. So I actually have just made some notes, because I'm sorry to say I've just been a few days out of hospital where I spent 6 days with pneumonia and gastroenteritis. So I was planning to write up my paper at that time, but having been out a few days, I just made a few notes. Anyhow, so I want to just go a little bit about my time with the Chewong. I arrived initially in September 75, and that was in order to do my PhD research, field research. At that time, the area where the Chewong lived, which is a sort of central, south central, middle sort of really Pahang area, south of the Jahut, and with not many other interactions. They didn't have an interaction with anybody really, except with the Jahut neighbors to the north. It was an area which still required security clearance at that time. It's known as a black area. So it took a little while before I got in, but once I was there was no problem. And of course, the forest at that time was much, much bigger than what it is today, as Kirk was saying. The area where they lived had been designated as a game reserve, the Crow Game Reserve. This was done by the British in 1926. They just drew a circle on the map without ever having been there. And one game warden called Orangusley, he was the first to contact the Chewong just before the Second World War. And he came back after the war, and he's written 2 small articles about them, which are actually quite useful for somebody coming later. He became very fond of them, as people tend to do with them if they live with Orang Asli. The forest, it's not a large group. The Chewong has never been a large group. They live very similar to, as Kirk was talking about, in very small nuclear type-based families, usually with 1 or 2 elderly couples with their married daughters and their families. So there's a slight sort of matri location tendency among the Chewong after marriage, where the daughters would stay with their parents. After that, they moved about pretty equally. So at the time, you had to walk, of course. There was no rivers big enough to negotiate. So we walked on foot everywhere. But the distances weren't huge. But nevertheless, where I ended up living, doing most of my field work was sort of half a day walk from the closest Malay village, Kampong Bolok, which was north of a little town called Lanchang before you come to Temelor on the sort of trans highway. And then you walked from there for about 2 or 3 hours, and you came to the first settlement, which actually was a settlement that had been established by the game reserve as a way of having having a base there. And they'd appointed one Chewong man to be what they called the ranger. So he lived there with his family permanently. That was the only sort of permanent settlement. He received a small stipend. And from there were several places to go. There were several other villages, not that many settlements, not that many. 6 hours walk away, perhaps a couple of them. The one where I ended up, we overnighted in the forest on the way in order to get up there. And from there were about 2 or 3 other settlements, a couple of hours walk away. But people moved. I mean, the settlement that I stayed in for 1 year, and after that we moved, and moved a couple of hours away, in fact, and so on. And people did do some basic form of shifting cultivation, nothing very fancy, ubikayo, maybe some maize, and that was it really. Otherwise, there was the hunting, a lot of gathering, blowpipes. They made traps for wild boar and porcupine around their fields, and went out with occasionally with dogs and parang for wild pig. So the situation in 75 and 76 was very similar to Kirk's, although perhaps even more remote, because they received no medical help from anybody. There was no helicopter power anywhere. There was no helicopter coming in. There were no expeditions from Gombak that came to them in those years. No school, and they had been told that they could go to a clinic in the nearby town of Nanyang if they wanted medical supply or medical help, but nobody ever did. I mean, they had the same fear that has already been talked about, which today is much, much less, of course, because of what I'm going to tell you, what happened. Something very dramatic happened in the Chewong situation. The worst kind of health problem really were for women. Pregnant women, childbirth often did not go well. Either the women would die or the baby would die. Again, this has changed a lot now. Today, most women would go to hospital to have a child delivered, but then they did not. They had very little sophisticated health care themselves. It would be spells, blowing on the body, or in more extreme cases, they would perform what they call the lepo, which would be a sort of shamanistic seance. That did not happen very often, but it did happen. What they suffered mostly from, again, and just a stomach upset. They talked a lot about stomach upset. They talked a lot about cough. You know, how their chest was so bad and their stomach. But those were the things that they particularly concerned about. Malaria, there was quite a lot of, I think. I mean, although they wouldn't know that themselves, but later when the medical team came and tested, they found a very large distribution of malaria. Health was terribly caught up in their cosmology, so that causation, diagnosis, was linked with taboos and the breaches of taboos. And they have a lot of them. I mean, I've written about them in my book. They all were named. Children were taught them from a very early age. A lot of them had to do mixing, elements that should be kept separate. That applies to food. Different kinds of food stuff should not be carried in the same basket coming home from the forest. They should not be cooked over the same fire. They should not be eaten at the same meal, and so on and so forth. And illness would always be referred back to having broken one of these taboos. And if there was the shamanistic seance, of course, the person who sent usually his soul out into the non-visual world to contact spirit guides and so on, would always try to find out the diagnosis and would also ask for help to cure. And they would always end up with a reason. You know, it's a very rational system. They found the reason. You did that, you shouldn't have done it, and this is what happened. They were not just all behavioral rules, they were also emotional rules, but I can't really get into that. And the most strong of all, of course, which I think is very powerful to understand these very loosely organized societies with no leaders, with no fixed institutions, hardly, is this notion of what they call punien, which in their case basically means do not eat alone. Always bring back what you have of food that you caught in the forest and share it with everybody who's present. If you don't do that, the person you do not share with will become ill. This is sort of what I call an unfulfilled desire. And that, of course, links people together in a sense of community and a moral community. Punien only applies to insiders. It does not apply to outsiders. So it's a way of creating a moral community that has a very strong base. I'm very curious, really, when I went back very briefly 2 years ago in connection with the CHAGS conference, things have changed very much. And I was curious to see if I could ascertain to what extent these taboos were still operative amongst the younger people. And I found that they weren't really. They did not really know them. And they were not all that interested in them either. And their older generation seemed not to invoke them in the way that they had done sort of 20 years previously. So this seems to be dying. And of course, if that dies, then the whole ontology dies on the basis, because they are so intertwined. with their so-called animistic type of religion, that they were very strong adherents, very strong exponents, if you like, to a sort of animistic type of religion, which is not really so powerful anymore. Now, I have to say that the last time in 2018, and the time before that, I think about 2012, I did not go into the deep jungle. I mean, there is still deep jungle settlements, and I have a sense that the people who live deeper in are much more traditional, if you like, that they still don't send their children to school. They don't come out except just to sell sort of forest produce and get cash and buy some of the sort of consumer stuff that they like, and sweet stuff, and also rice, for which is very popular. But I still think that, having talked to some of my older friends from my initial time, they still feel that the taboo system is very relevant in their daily lives. What am I doing? The Chewang, of course, I mean, in terms of what I'm talking about, the animistic cosmology, is amongst a generation of people, men mainly, who were my good friends when I was there, who were then young fathers and are still alive, because people don't die. It's quite amazing. 18 months fieldwork, not a single person died. I was getting desperate. And very sweetly, I think I'll just take some time to tell, very sweetly, when I was going down for the last time from the deep jungle to the outside and leaving for at least a few years, we overnighted, and suddenly one of my good friends, who was very knowledgeable about esoteric matters, suddenly, without warning, began to sing a song I'd never heard before. And he began to dance. And the other people there looked quite shocked. And they whispered to me, "This is the death ritual, the funeral ritual." So this was his parting gift to me, really, because this particular ritual was a ritual that could not be performed outside an actual death situation. So it was quite a risky thing to do. But he knew I wanted so much to see it and to find out about it. So he performed it all by himself and sang the song and did the dance. And it's the only time that Chewang dance is in connection with a funeral. They don't dance at other times. They don't dance during their shamanistic seances. So at least in a sense, I got a sort of vicarious sense of how they behave at the funeral. So, but as I say, many of the men still have their songs, their shamanistic songs, which they either received in an individual encounter during a seance, during a spirit journey, or that they've inherited from either their father or a brother or something like that. And they were very willing to sing that for me when I was there in 2012. But the young people weren't interested. It was quite interesting. You know, they had a sort of sessions and they were singing, and the older women would do the drumming with their bamboo, but the young guys were just off on their motorbikes or whatever. So anyhow, so towards the end of my second stay, which was when I came back for 3 months, there was beginning to be some more organized medical provisions to the Chewang. And later, during the 80s, what was very dramatic happened. It was the elephant reservation, what you call it, set up, how this was started. You probably all know about it. It's a big tourist attraction in Malaysia now. They have elephants. They bring them to this place and keep them there so they should prevent from dying, because there's not enough natural space for elephants to continue to roam in the Malaysian forests. So they bring them there, and they have about 5 or 6 elephants now. And it's been built up into huge place for tourists. 100,000 more visits came a couple of years ago. Busloads come from Kuala Lumpur on Sundays, full of people. School children come, families come. It's another big new highway, which is much closer and much faster. You get there very fast, actually, from KL. And they started exactly where the game reserve hut had been initially when I first got there. And they just expanded outwards from there, and they pushed all the Geelong away. And eventually they began to, not very far at all. And that they also gave them, they began to build the sort of new houses that the picture showed us, these sort of white cement type houses, the long row, with windows and doors that closed, so sort of social interaction was kind of prevented from how it used to be when people just lived in lean-tos or so on and chatted throughout the night to each other. Now people closed their doors and closed their windows and had televisions, of course. Very, I mean, physical structures can affect social life really quite considerably. Okay, so these new buildings, so of course again, government policy, get them out of the forest, get them settled, bring them to school, give them health services, and hopefully engage in some sedentary agriculture in order to make a living. This is a tough aim, actually, but quite a lot of Geelong have by now moved into one of these houses. Some of them have it as a sort of holiday home. They continue to live inside a forest where they go on hunting and they go on living in the way that they pretty much did actually, but they come out much more frequently, and then they stay maybe for a week or two in these houses that they have been given. They've been given on the basis of kinship, as far as I can see. A sort of head of a family has been given a house, and they have water and toilet, electricity, and so on. But again, health, of course, is still a continuous preoccupation. And they will always complain about being ill, and they will also complain about it being so hot. I don't know how the others say that, the forest is cool. Being cool is being healthy. Moving out, living on the edges of the forest is hot. Being close to gob is being very hot, and that leads to illness. They talk about this quite a lot, but they still live there. And, the attraction of the sort of food stuff that they can buy, the sweets, eating rice instead of ubi kayo, and so on, is still very attractive, and has some of the health consequences that Kirk mentioned, especially with the women. Obesity, from lack of movement, really, mainly. The women used to be so active in the forest. There were lots of work for them to do. In this new village, there's very little for women to do. At least they could do things, but they don't. I mean, they don't go into the forest to collect rattan, for example. They don't go to forest to collect wild mushrooms or something like that. They leave it all to men. So it's a very new imbalance is moving into the society, which is quite striking. So they sit there and they get fat, which is not very healthy and not very attractive. So the diet, I think, has declined in quality. I do believe it has. But the population seems to have increased. Like, I haven't got figures on that, but certainly there were so many young people when I was there 2 years ago, many, many more I ever seen. And so, the death rate of children and infants is perhaps showing in the fact that so many young people are growing up. And this is also something rather weird, which is that they seem to be taller than they used to be. And Kirk confirmed that he had that impression himself with the Baltic when he was there. And this is just an impression, but there seem to be a lot of quite tall young people, much more than had been so in the past. Let's see. Now, this elephant reserve, which is right next door, has a lot of very strange effects. I mean, first of all, the kind of conditions that are granted to the Malay employees who live inside are so much better than the kind of housing and conditions that are provided for the Orang Asli right next door. The houses are very nice, much better. And also the school is much better. It used to be. I think now they seem to go to the same school. Now they seem to be bused. Everybody seems to be bused to schools in a nearby Malay village where they are all mixed up, which probably is a very good thing. The thing is that children so far most children are not very good attendance at the schools. But some are, and some are become very literate and are beginning to take an interest in the world outside. So far, Chewang have not been active in Orang Asli sort of what should I say, activities, but there are some signs that they are beginning to join some of the Orang Asli action groups and so on, and that will be the younger people. At the same time, when I was there 2 years ago, there was an election of a new button, and the two candidates, sort of middle-aged men, both of them were illiterate. So there's still some way to go in order to make them sufficiently prepared to be active members of the wider society in which they are finding themselves these days. Yeah. So some of the Chewang have been employed at the elephant reserve, which is where they receive a regular salary. Of course, they are employed at the very lowest end of the manual labor type of, but nevertheless, the jobs are very sought after. They would like to get the regular income. What else can I say? So I don't know. I don't know what the future will hold here. Hopefully, I think that it's so mixed. The thing is that the messages are so mixed that one gets. One has the deep forest people still living in there, and they say that it's secret. The authorities don't know about it. They don't know they live in there, and they are living in there. So, and as long as the boundaries of the Crown Game Reserve are respected by the government, there's no reason why they shouldn't go on living there, because they are respected. So far, they are respected, and all the logging on all sides, I don't know the northern side, but I guess also, has been gone right up to the boundaries of the Crown Game Reserve, and then the forest begins, the primal forest begins. So they can't go on. They can go on seemingly for a while yet, and then you have all the people on the outside living in this more modern type environment with all their motorbikes and so on. And relationship or kinship are still very prevalent between the outside village and the deep forest village. I certainly can see that. There's a little bit of intermarriage, although that is getting less and less, I've got to say. Very few young people want to actually move from the outside village and all the comforts that they have there into the deeper forest and take up the sort of more traditional way of life. So it's more the people who are born there who stay there for the time being. So anyhow, so I think that with improved health services, with improved education, Chewang may be able to become more active participants. I think Colin will have something to say about that because he knows the Chewang quite well and has been visiting them quite a lot and trying to help them to become more active, take some sort of proactive, as it were, even. But it's disturbing that when you come driving up on this wonderful new asphalt road where I used to trek on foot in a sort of very basic forest environment, to now drive sort of tarmac road, wonderful road up to the big parking place for the elephant reserve place. And just before you moved in to the parking place there's a tiny little mud road that goes up to the left, but you can't really see where it's leading, but it only goes for 100 meters. And then you come to the Chewang village. So you sort of get a kind of unpleasant feeling, I do, of sometimes people go to look at the elephants first. Having done that, they sort of turn around and they go and look at the primitive people after that. And some people have absolutely no shame about the way they enter the village, that particular village. Anyway, so the Chewang are coping with it now. They're not frightened anymore the way they used to, run away. So I think I'll stop there, actually. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. We are starting to run a little bit behind time, so let's save questions for Signe for after the talks during the discussion period. And let's move on to the next talk. So thank you again. So the next speaker is Geoffrey Benjamin, talking about the JOA's medical services, the early days. Geoffrey, are you there and ready to share
Yes,
your
sure.
screen? Okay, we can see you now.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet. We see you. We see your face.
I don't know why it isn't sharing here. Yeah, okay. You see it now?
Yes, perfect. Ready
Okay,
to go.
good.
Thanks.
Okay, I got a written out talk. I hope it'll be short. I made no formal study of how modern medicine was made available to the Orang Asli during my fieldwork. So this is necessarily going to be an informal talk, not really plugged into the questions you asked us initially, but I can perhaps do that on another occasion if you're putting this together. On the other hand, I was myself almost completely dependent on the logistical and communication services provided by the medical section of the JOA. And crucially, these were, first of all, the monthly flying doctor visits by Dr. Malcolm Bolton, who also served as my postman, which was important. And I'll talk about him later. And second, for my supplies, I was dependent on the monthly parachuted medical airdrops to the JOA post downriver from where I was at post Lambuk. I had plenty of opportunity, therefore, to witness how the medical services were run in the more remote areas. But my comments on what I saw will necessarily still be anecdotal. Now, after I first arrived in Malaysia in February 1964 to do doctoral fieldwork, I visited several Orang Asli villages in different parts of the country while deciding where my Temia fieldwork was to be carried out. On Iskandar Keri's advice, he actually was my field supervisor as well, the chosen site was the small settlement of Kuala Humid or Bok Hamid in Temia on the Prolat River in Kelantan. So on April Fool's Day 1964, I reported early in the morning at KL's former Sungai Besi airport, where I was loaded onto a British Royal Air Force helicopter, identified not as a human being, but as an X-ray machine for upcountry delivery. At this distance in time, I assume it's now safe to mention this subterfuge carried on at the highest level of a government department. It shows that the JOA was actually remarkably keen to enable my research. And to put you in the picture, the only substantial ethnographic research that had been done up to that time was Bob Denton's, of course, although I didn't meet him until many years later, but he had recently finished his own work just before I started my own. An hour later, I was dropped at Kuala Humid with all my equipment, to the amazement of the villagers who had not, and that time could not have been, forewarned. I had, however, already spoken to the village headman, Penghulu Dalam, who was hospitalized at Gombak suffering from TB. And that was just enough to give me the necessary entree into Kuala Humid. Here's a distant view of Hamid that I took months later by courtesy of a visiting British military helicopter. The pilot turfed out the co-pilot illegally, allowing me into the aircraft to take some photographs, which I'm very glad I was able to take. The isolation is obvious. That's the landing zone. Hamid, that's the main range. They're looking Perak's on the other side. This is the Hamid River here. Closer view here. You can see how isolated it is, but it still received medical services. Here's a top view from the same flight. This village was several hours walk upstream from the JOA post at Lambuk, and it was situated at the limit of accessibility along the Prolat River by motorboat, but even then only when the river was high. Normally, one simply had to walk through the forest to get anywhere, even to Gua Musang, which at that time had only a railway connection with the rest of the country. Gua Musang wasn't on the road itself. As you can see from this top view picture, Hamid was a small settlement with around 30 people. It had a helicopter landing zone here, known in Temia as a lisek, which is LZ in the way they pronounced it, on a flattened rise at the highest point in the village. This was actually a very small hill, made stable by a tightly woven split bamboo matting. You can just see the rectangle there. Besides being used occasionally by the military, because Temia country, just like Signe just said, as the case amongst the Chewang even later, Temia country was still black from a security point of view, so there were still military movements in the area, and I had to get clearance if I wanted to move around. The main purpose of this was to allow Dr. Malcolm Bolton's monthly flying visits, and if necessary, also to allow emergency medical evacuations. At the bottom of this path leading down the hill from the LZ was a small locked here, modern building, small hut, but cement, tin roof and so on. Locked and waterproof building for the storage of basic medicines. These included gentian violet, which the Tamils call ubat gas, or skin disease medicine, for treating kurap, Tinea imbricata, skin infection. It had chloroquine for treating and preventing malaria, had aspirin for minor ailments, and there were some first aid bandages and some bright yellow acroflavine solution for treating wounds. I regret I haven't located a photograph of this particular hut's interior, sorry. But I will show you a picture of another one later. Incidentally, I don't know whether gentian violet is still around, but it's very recently been declared to be potentially carcinogenic. The hut had no electronic communication to the rest of the world. In an emergency, therefore, someone had to walk downstream for several hours to the JOA post at Lombok, which did have a regular radio connection of the kind mentioned already by Kirk, a connection with the JOA hospital at Gombak, and I think also with, there was a smaller JOA hospital at Kuala Lipis. This is what Kuala Humid looks like today. There's the Kuala right there, there's the Humid, and this is the Prolak River, and that's where the village was. So I don't need to make any further comment about this. It's not existed as a Temia settlement for many years now. I'm still in touch with some of the people or their descendants, but they now live in various other places in Kelantan, Perak, and elsewhere, and also some of them in town. I'm pleased to report that one of the people I'm in touch with, the granddaughter of one of the 1960s villagers, is now a trained dental nurse, professional one, after taking a four-year degree course several years ago at the Dental College in Penang. She travels around Orang Asli villages in her own car, checking dental health and sometimes pulling bad teeth. She jokes that even as a child, she always wanted to pull teeth. The hut at Humid was in charge of a young Temia man named Malam. Here he is, lining up for a race downstream at Lombok and Hari Ibu Bapa, organized by the school teachers there. As a sign of the state of medical knowledge at that time, here's another photo I took at this same event, a ladies' smoking competition to see who would be first to get through a fag. This was organized by the teachers at the school. Now, although Malam here could neither read nor write, he had attended one of the JOA special courses in Kuala Lipis, I think. These courses trained selected Orang Asli in basic first aid and medicine provision, so that as many settlements as possible should have such a person on hand. The majority of Orang Asli in those days could, of course, speak Malay, but very few of them indeed were literate. The courses were therefore designed expressly for non-literate participants. These basically trained medical attendants were paid a small monthly retainer, but I can't remember now how much this was. At the time, though, even this small payment served to introduce a little cash into the communities, but it also led to a degree of social differentiation and occasional resentment. Most people had no access to cash at all. I, of course, had with me a wider range of medicines than were available in the JOA's store, and I found myself treating such ailments as chronically infected eyelids and diarrhea. I should mention that already in the mid-1960s, several Orang Asli had received a more professional level of medical training. For example, when I finally caught chloroquine-resistant malaria in 1965, chloroquine-resistant because of the Vietnam War, and also I contracted falciparum and vivax simultaneously, so I was getting fevers every day. This was confirmed by a Samai laboratory assistant at the Gombak Hospital who had examined my blood under a microscope and been trained in elementary pathology. At the time, the Gombak Hospital itself was a rather different place than it is now. In order to encourage sick Orang Asli to be warded there, they were allowed to bring along some close kin to stay with them. And the families often ended up sharing the same bed. I believe this was stopped many years ago, and perhaps it would no longer be necessary, in the sense that I suspect most Orang Asli would now be happy to go to hospital without bringing the whole family with them. But it was a striking feature of Gombak Hospital while it lasted. So let me make a few comments on health-related issues as I witnessed them in the field. Children were still being born at home in the villages, supervised by their own traditional midwives. A few births occurred while I was in the field, and these didn't seem to have been especially difficult. The newly delivered mothers were up and about, or at least active. They weren't allowed down on the ground at first, but they were active and seemed quite well quite soon after the birth. The change to hospital births came later. I'm not sure whether this is now universal for Temias, may or may not be. However, several researchers, including Dr. Bolton himself, and earlier than that, Ivan Polunin, reported the special dietary restrictions that attended the mother, as well as in the Temia case, the father and the midwife as well, are likely to have had detrimental effects, and in particular restricted the newly delivered mother from eating quite a range of high protein foods. The details of these restrictions and the resultant supposed diseases associated with them are spelled out in my Temia religion book. Unfortunately, I also witnessed infants and toddlers dying from diarrhea, which I was unable to do much about. The villagers didn't regularly boil their drinking water, or I should say they didn't do it at all, well, hardly ever. Some of them had kettles, metal kettles, but they took the water from the river. Boiling would have been difficult on log fires in bamboo tubes. They regarded the water as safe though, because, so they claimed, the upstream villages were sufficiently well spaced out to allow the fish to consume any human waste. And they still drank it even when it was muddy after heavy rain. I chlorinated my own drinking water, which was also drawn from the river. Tuberculosis was still common, and not all of the sufferers were prepared to be taken to hospital, despite being urged to go there. It was so common, in fact, that a coughing fit was often greeted humorously with cries of TB, TB. Malaria was common, but it seemed to be in some kind of equilibrium, at least amongst the adults, to judge by their permanently swollen spleens. Indeed, the Temian name for malaria is klab, which means spleen. They did seem aware, though, that mosquitoes had something to do with it, perhaps as a result of the training courses that some of them had been on. Now, of course, without the regular medical screening expected today, there would have been other medical problems that went unrecognized and untreated. I do remember, though, that one old man's painful leg was diagnosed by Dr. Bolton as a case of gout, so much for gout being regarded as a disease of overindulgence. He also pointed out to me a case of yaws that he was treating, which even then had become rare in Malaysia, though it is still endemic in Indonesia. I also saw some cases of what would probably now be regarded as mildly psychotic behavior. One such was explained as the result of the poor man having accidentally been buried alive and then disinterred when it became apparent that he hadn't died after all. Now, although I didn't witness them directly myself, 2 cases of death by falling out of trees, as similar to what Kirk already mentioned, 2 cases of death by falling out of trees occurred during my fieldwork. One was a Temia, another was a Batek, and both happened while the men were collecting honey high up in the tree, and no emergency treatment was available. I'll finish with a few more photographs taken during my final month of fieldwork in August 1965. when Dr. Bolton invited me to join him for a few days on his flying doctor rounds in Perak and Kelantan. That was really an extremely welcome opportunity, most unexpected, and I was very glad of it. This time I took off from the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Butterworth. This photo shows Dr. Bolton himself with one of the more fully trained medical field staff inside the medical hut at Fort Legap. They were going through a record book, presumably indicating the medicines that had been dispensed, and you can see some of the medicines on the shelf behind them. This shot from the next day further east in Kelantan shows Dr. Bolton about to check on the Batek community at Post Lebir, which Kirk has already talked about. Very nice Batek bamboo comb there. Here's our helicopter. It was obviously of interest to the Bateks, but by now it was well within their normal expectations that helicopters should be landing regularly at Post Lebir. Like many settlements, of course, Post Lebir is now on the road and helicopters are no longer necessary. You can get in there by wheeled transport. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of airdrops to keep the remote interior areas supplied with essentials. This picture shows one such drop being unpacked, and one of the twin Pioneer aircraft, this is actually made in Scotland, aircraft used for the purpose. These are very slow flying, short landing and takeoff aircraft, although I don't think that the twin ones landed at Lombok, but as you can see, here's the hatch through which they dropped the parachutes. The silk parachutes themselves, despite their gaudy yellow color, were regularly commandeered by the Temias and sewn into clothing, and they were real silk. This practice was eventually stopped, of course, and the parachutes are recycled. Here's a single Pioneer, which they also used. This did sometimes land at Lombok, a bit dangerous, but there was enough of a landing strip there. And here's a pretty good model made in Hamid village of a single Pioneer aircraft by someone who'd probably never even ridden in a motor car. And lastly, if can you see all of the screen? Because I've got the rest of the faces of the rest of you showing on the right. You can? Okay. Lastly, if you would like an excellent insider's account of the early days of the JOA's medical services, I strongly recommend this now rare book. She was the chief nurse, actually, opening up Gombak originally. If you can locate a copy. But only if he's online tonight. I don't think he is, but he won't need to be told about this, as the book is dedicated to him. And I know for a fact he has a signed copy from the author. Lastly, for the state of affairs during the emergency and before the JOA's medical service got off the ground, I recommend the published version of Ivan Polunin's doctoral thesis. If you can find a copy of the full references here. I have the last one. He gave it to me, which is very nice of him. Many of us will remember Ivan fondly as a great supporter of our fieldwork. He himself did excellent ethnographic fieldwork on the indigenous Jahut medical system. So that is the end of my talk, but if you have further plans, I can expand it later in written form. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That was really fascinating. Okay, so as before, I think we should probably move on and hold questions for later. So we have one final talk today by Csilla Dallos, talking about her work among the Llano in the 1990s. Csilla, are you there and ready to share your screen?
I'm here.
Oh, terrific. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so go ahead and share your screen when you're ready. Thanks for joining us.
Yes. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, I think it looks great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. All right. So first of all, thank you very much, Vivek, for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk about and share my work today. I conducted a year-long ethnographic fieldwork among the Lano as a cultural anthropologist a little bit later in the 1990s. And I'm today here to talk about this research in the context of the question how to make Orang Asli healthcare and health services more equitable. So in the past 40 years, it has become increasingly evident that government measures to improve Orang Asli health have not always been successful. And it has also become obvious that in order to improve Orang Asli healthcare, we have to understand Orang Asli point of view. So there have been more and more qualitative research trying to understand Orang Asli perspectives, which is a wonderful thing. But most of this research have been brief and interview or sometimes even focus group based. And so these brief research projects have to have some methodological limitations. And in this talk, I especially would like to address these limitations, although they often seem reliable in terms of producing consistent responses across participants. At the same time, it is not quite sure whether they accurately represent indigenous perceptions of health. So really, this is what I would like to focus on today and advocate long-term observation-based research when it comes to understanding Orang Asli perceptions of health, because this such approach can actually point to relationships that don't necessarily surface during brief interviews and interview-based projects. And I'm going to suggest that because of that, this long-term participant observation-based research might be actually indispensable when it comes to understanding Orang Asli health. So in order to make this point, I will try to illustrate this point by focusing on 3 issues. The first one is protein deficiency, which is a very important problem that affects especially Orang Asli women and children. The second, well, Ivan was asking about this, so I'm actually going to talk about this a little bit. I'm going to talk about attitudes towards healthcare providers and how an ethnographic approach can aid us understanding these attitudes. And third, I like to talk about something that I haven't actually come across as much, talk about increasing inequalities among Orang Asli and their health implications. So first, I would like to begin with some background. The Lano, actually, the autonym of the Lano is Semablum, which means people of the Big River. And in this case, Big River designates the Perak River, to which the Lano had a very important spiritual connection. But like other Orang Asli, they suffer serious losses of cultural and spiritual values as a result of resettlement and regroupment. And so the spiritual connection has also been severed as a result of resettlement. The Lano resettlement began in the 1980s, and it was directly connected to the Sungai Pera hydroelectric project, and in particular, the construction of the Canering Dam, which affected traditional Lano land and areas. So at the time, in order to deal with this situation, the government initiated 2 kinds of regroupment schemes. In one, people were asked to move into one of these huge resettlement villages, Fort Kamar, Aibanun, or Aydala, which each of them had about 1,000 people, or even more, sometimes even 2,000. And the other approach was to actually group neighboring villages into a single administrative settlement within their existing location. So IBA was one of these projects. So I don't know how much you can see it on the map, but IBA is located near Langong, about half an hour from Greek, the major town in the area. And unlike the larger resettlement scheme, again, it was much smaller. It had only 200 people at the time of my research. And as you can see, the government issued the infrastructure such as wooden flag houses with the usual zinc roof, which is horrible actually in the midday heat, as anybody who has been in one of these settlements can attest. Road, electricity, and piped water supply. And but at this time of my research, actually, the village was still very much in transition, and the composition of the village was changeable. Before resettlement, Lano had a flexible and fluid social organization, like all Semang people, with far-reaching kinship and friendship ties. And at the time of my research, people were still coming and going, visiting frequently. And as you can see, even though the village had these government-issued large wooden houses, people still stayed in the background. You can see Tamiar-style bamboo houses, as well as Lano-style lean-to shelters. Nonetheless, the implication of resettlement already showed in reduced livelihood, as well as changing dietary patterns in the village. So this leads me to my first point, how ethnographic studies can help us better understand how and why protein deficiency affects women and children. Like most of these RPS villages, the village of Iba was a very poor environment. It was bounded by rubber and palm oil plantations. And by 1998, the resources were entirely depleted around the village. Hunting was nearly impossible. Fishing was never a possibility in Iba because the river was very far from the village. Iba used to be an old paddy planting site of the Lano, and people considered it entirely unsuitable for permanent settlement. People also didn't have any means of transportation, so they couldn't pursue hunting and fishing at more distant locations. And also the villagers' ability to buy food was extremely limited. Like people had very low income or no income at all. And so there was a feeling of increasing hardship and considerable food insecurity in the village. And even on the rare occasion that people bought food, it was not fish or meat, but less nutritious items such as biscuits, sugar, cooking oil, sweetened condensed milk, or of course, tobacco. Yet the lack of animal protein didn't actually impact everybody equally. Women and children were far less likely to obtain animal protein than men did. And some of the reasons why this is so is actually related to some cultural ideas. So there was an increasing difference in men's and women's mobility and activity patterns compared to the past. Men would still leave for days and weeks to pursue forest collecting in the forest at remote locations. And while they were doing that, they were also able to regularly hunt wild game, and so they were able to consume meat protein. But that was not the case with women and children, who stayed in the village most of the time. Children were never actually encouraged to leave the village because it was considered very dangerous for them. But women, as it has been said, they were very mobile in the past. And usually, well, the Lanu had both logistical mobility and residential mobility, but in either case, women usually were able to go wherever men went. But these days they were much less mobile, and partly this is because of the larger number of children. In the past, the Lanu tried to have 3 children, and they tried to have the next child only when the previous child was old enough to walk and carry a few things by themselves. But by 1999, they actually, women gave birth on average every 2 years. So this made them much more sedentary than they were in the past. But in addition to this sedentism, there were also cultural ideas, namely food taboos, that affected women's protein consumption. So in the past, Lanu had menstruation taboos. It meant that women were actually supposed to refrain from eating the meat of certain animal species during menstruation. This was mostly large game. But these days, these prohibitions have become quite generalized to all meat at all times. It seemed to me that men really felt obliged but unable to support their families with meat. And they actually used food taboos as an excuse for this inability to provide for their families. They said that since it was impossible for a woman to know when they would menstruate, they would just refrain from eating meat altogether. So women still collected vegetable and mushrooms in the nearby field and forest daily. But apart from this, they and also children mostly subsisted on carbohydrates, tapioca, and rice. This also meant that women and children were doubly affected by their diet because in addition to lack of protein increases, lack of protein results in iodine deficiency. The increase of cassava production also inhibits iodine uptake. So my second example and the second point I would like to make today is that ethnographic study help us also better understand women's attitude to health services and healthcare providers, and in general people's attitude. So health services in IBA at the time of my research included monthly visits by a mobile medical team from Greek, and the team consisted of a Chinese doctor, Malay nurses, and also a Malay driver. And they performed checkups of mothers, infants, and pregnant women. Treatments included vaccinations and blood tests for hepatitis. And in addition to this, mothers were also given milk and iodized salt to prevent and cure goiter. Also, most children in IBA had worms, for which they were treated regularly. Apart from caring for women and children, health services' primary concern was malaria and malaria control. So officers performed blood tests and distributed treated mosquito nets. People at the time, however, still relied on traditional practices. All children were born in the village, for instance. There were four Lanu midwives, and people didn't voluntarily visit the clinic or hospital. It has been a common complaint by healthcare providers that the Orangusley are difficult to deal with because seeing officers, half of the village runs to the forest. And recently, there has even been a paper called Why We Run Away When the Doctor Comes. So I would like to address this question in two parts. firstly, why people avoid hospital visits in the city, and second, why women dislike village visits by the mobile medical team. So in brief, people avoided the hospital in Greek because they felt disrespected and threatened by the medical personnel. They complained that they were treated condescendingly, patronizingly. They often said that they were treated like children, for instance, scolded for not coming soon enough. And they were also afraid to make the doctors angry because they believed that they would be injected until they died. But in addition to feeling threatened, they were also berated and accused of being dirty. And hygiene is an issue often brought up in relation to Orangusley health. So I would like to address this now. So it is true that many infections, such as parasitic infections, children suffer from are related to lack of hygiene. But very commonly, Orangusley are blamed for this lack of hygiene. For instance, in overcrowded RPS settlement, researchers observed lack of environmental cleanliness, including the indiscriminate disposal of garbage. So I want to emphasize that smaller villages like Arba, this was not at all the case. So even with a lack of cultural precedent of environmental maintenance, people went to great lengths, absolute great lengths to keep the settlement clean and free of garbage. They recycled non-perishable materials. They used every little bit of metal or plastic. And so the village was actually squeaky clean at all times. However, they dealt with a very important issue, which they also affected hygiene and which they were unable to resolve by their own. So, and this was the water supply. So as I said, the village received its water through a gravity feed system, but there was really frequent disruption to the water supply, sometimes for several days. And at those times, people, usually women, had to carry water from the river that was 20 minutes away, actually walking distance, one way, on their head. So to return to the question why Lano avoided medical facilities in the city, they very much resented being unfairly accused for conditions that were actually not their fault. Now, I would like to turn to the second part of the question of why, about the attitude of Orangusley to healthcare providers. And the second part of this question is why women dislike visits by the mobile medical team. It has been pointed out that healthcare of Orangusley is rather inconsistent, and it largely depends on individuals and personalities or practitioners. And in Arba, members of the visiting medical team actually had friendly relations with people. The doctor and nurses were absolutely respectful and kind, and they treated people very well. Still, people, especially women, did not look forward to these visits for several reasons. So first, there was a problem of communication. Instructions of how to take medicine, for instance, were usually given in very rapid Malay without checking if women understood them. And this was a problem because many women in Arba didn't speak or understand Malay very well. But the second reason involved the medical examination itself. Women often were very embarrassed by the tone of questionings. So questions asked by the doctor and the nurses often concerned sexual and reproductive behavior. For instance, they would be asked, like, why do you have so many children? Or even when they made children, and bila mereka buat anak. And women in Arba said that they were very shy and did not like to talk about these matters in front of other people. They said that when they treat their own people, they would ask respectfully in a room. But for us, they ask us in front of everybody. So actually women's attitude towards health practitioners was very much influenced by their cultural ideas about how one discusses sexuality and reproduction, which is very important to understand if we are to address these health issues and their attitude towards health services. The third example or illustration of why ethnographic study is important is that ethnographic studies can help us better understand increasing inequalities and its consequences for health. And this is an issue that I haven't seen much addressed in the literature. So research on Orangusley health is often too brief to reveal any differences in people's health status. And even studies targeting women and children often treat Orangusley villages as one homogeneous population. On the contrary, my research showed that certain segments of the population were affected more negatively by resettlement than others. So, the reason for this is that Llano resettlement involved regrouping people and families from all parts of Llano land. And so this included people and families who would not normally come together. And these families didn't just magically get along, but they would consider each other different or lying. And especially women, they would not necessarily mix together. A second part of this issue was that some of these families were larger than others with more extensive kinship ties in the village. And these families became increasingly more prominent and influential. On the other hand, people with fewer relatives were increasingly marginalized and even ostracized. So these smaller families, or their members rather, were excluded from sharing networks. For instance, they were denied share of land, as well as government handouts and assistance, such as planting seeds, fruit trees, tools, and even training programs. And members of these families, that is also very important for socioeconomic equality or inequality. They were excluded from work groups as well, especially that of women. Men more often mixed across kinship groups, as you can see this picture, like these guys just leaving for some contract work, and this group contains men from all kinship groups, but this was not the case with the women at all. Women mostly cooperated amongst within family groups. There was a very strong cooperation between sisters and nieces and aunts and mothers and daughters, but they didn't really mix or cooperate or even communicate sometimes across kinship groups. So yet another implication of this discrepancy in the size of families involved social safety nets. Members of larger families were able to depend on each other naturally more. So for instance, in larger families would often adopt and take care of each other's children, but such option was not available for those in smaller families. And finally, this different group size had also implications for children's work. Among the Llano, like among many Orang Asli, Semang in particular, children are not required to do any work or chores, and this was still the case in Aiba. But small marginalized families were also different in this respect, because to a greater extent than others, they had to rely on their children for various chores, for instance, minding siblings, or performing other tasks, for instance, fetching water. So this discrepancy in size of families and avoiding to mix with unrelated people already had very important and discernible health implications. So compared to the larger resettlement villages, RPS villages, the population of Aiba was relatively small, and this certainly contributed to fewer health problems and health issues. For instance, in the 1990s, when I was doing my research, there was absolutely no alcoholism, TB, diabetes, or obesity, and that had that have become more common in larger villages. And consequently, unlike people in large resettlement villages, people in Iba didn't receive any regular food baskets or supplements. That is with the exception of these marginalized families. During my fieldwork, children from two marginalized families were identified by the medical team as malnourished, and these families and their children began receiving regular food packages. So in conclusion, in this presentation, I wanted to show how cultural factors such as food taboos, beliefs about sexuality, and inclusion-exclusion based on kinship ties can affect the health of Orang Asli, in this case, Lano women and children. These examples further illustrate, I believe, that Orang Asli health cannot be narrowed down to medical solutions, and that a number of social and economic issues must be addressed. Above all, however, I wanted to convey that long-term ethnographic studies are valuable to counter and complement brief qualitative studies of Orang Asli health. Due to the history of dispossession and mistreatment, Orang Asli have lots of reasons to be cautious about immediately revealing their intentions and reasons for doing things. And this makes long-term research based on participant observation an indispensable methodology when studying Orang Asli health. As Nicholas and Bayer observed, the Orang Asli have an intense desire for healing to be integrated within their local social cultural context. To accomplish this will require long-term ethnographic studies using medical anthropological framework and practices, I believe. Thank you very much. And
All right. Well, thanks very much. That was really interesting. So thanks to all our presenters today. Those were terrific talks and really show how these long-term perspectives can lend insight into Orang Asli health. So it is, I guess, 10 p.m. Malaysia time. We're running a bit behind, but it seems like most people are still here. So we can keep going for another 20 or 30 minutes if people are willing to stick around. There's been some interesting conversation in the chat bar, if some of you are following that. What we'd like to do now is to try to get the audience a little more involved here and kind of open the floor. So we can either use the raise hand function or people can kind of speak up. Rodney, I don't know if you want to unmute people and people can just sort of chime in with any questions that they have for our speakers, or if you'd like to share your own experiences or observations in relation to what we've heard today.
People should also feel free to ask a question in the chat box and we can relay it. I see a hand up from Yao Li Fang. I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Yao.
Hi, everyone. I'm Li Fang. I'm from Malaysia. I have a question for, I guess, Csilla and maybe Geoffrey. So, 2 years back, I was working with the Termia. I work on saliva and gut microbiome. That's a collection of all the microbes that live in their body. So one of the findings was that we found that women had significantly more Prevotella and men had more bifidobacterium. So Prevotella is usually found if you eat like things like cassava. That's from studies that's done in the South America. And bifidobacterium usually if you consume cheese and dairy products. So I wanted to ask if if any of you guys had any experience with food taboos. And I know Geoffrey did some work with the Termia. So that was the basis of my discussion, that it was because of a food difference. So I wanted to know if you have anything, because I couldn't find anything much other than from the Geoffrey Benjamin's book. So that was the basis of my, so I was wondering if.
Well, I've nothing to add to what was in the book as regards food taboos. I know some other Malaysians have done a little bit of work recently on this. The dairy product that they mostly consume is, of course, sugared condensed milk. Whether that would feed the gut biome, I really don't know. I was interested in what Csilla said earlier about cassava or ubi kayu inhibiting iodine uptake, because one thing I forgot to mention is, in fact, there was quite a lot of goiter visible during the early days, some quite severe cases, in fact. Ivan Pulunin, as it happens, was one of the world experts on the epidemiology of goiter, so he probably published some material on that. People are increasingly buying their food rather than growing it or finding it themselves these days. So the children are certainly drinking sweetened milk drinks, not just condensed milk. So that may have some effect. But beyond that, I really not in a position to say, but I'd be very interested in whatever you found out about this.
Because I was wondering if there was any studies that mentioned that women were eating more vegetables compared to men, either due to taboos or anything.
Only in the sense that women who'd recently given birth or who were pregnant or who were menstruating were, at least in those days, quite strongly tabooed against eating quite a lot of protein-rich food, animal foods. Whether the extent to which that is still true, I don't know. Perhaps, as Signe said, for the Chewang, these rules are going by the wayside, but I don't have recent information on this, I'm sorry.
Right. I don't know if I may add that. So before these food taboos were occasional, like tied to certain phases of a woman's life. And also, importantly, they just affected large game. Interestingly, game that tends to be shared more widely, as opposed to small game that even women could, of course, obtain, or that was shared within the like the household or within a closer family. So these days it becomes generalized, and I just detected this tendency for men to, use it as an excuse, and because there was just barely any meat in the village, basically. And I knew that men were regularly hunting when they were forest collecting in the forest, obviously, like this is how they sustained it, but they didn't bring back food anymore, or meat to the village. So yeah, basically this is just what I wanted to add.
And Csilla, would people in the village complain about that, or was it a largely unrecognized phenomenon that people were eating meat in the forest, but not necessarily bringing it back to share?
Well, yes, women actually complained a little bit. yeah, they liked meat and they wanted, oh, there is no meat again. So yeah, I kept hearing that. Yes. But there was nothing to be done because the village was so surrounded by plantations, rubber and palm oil, that nothing survived there basically. And whatever survived, it was overhunted, depleted within like a day of walking distance. And so time to time, of course, people still could get something, but it was increasingly rare.
I would say, oh, sorry, Kirk, go ahead.
This reminds me of the Batek in the 70s. Women did not eat meat during their menstrual periods and right after giving birth. But I also remember people specifically saying we give women more meat when we share out meat in the times when they can eat meat. And so they were aware of that inequality in the diet, and women did eat an appreciable amount of meat because of that sharing. So it's like the taboo is there, but they also had a way to get around it.
Right, exactly. So it was just interesting how these ideas get twisted around, like when the circumstances change. Like in the entire year when I was there, I'd never seen actually like maybe one time there was a wild boar brought to the village, but that was it. Like other than that, just smaller animals like bamboo rats and squirrels and sometimes monkeys, gibbons, but no larger game.
Can I get it? Yeah. Well, actually, it reminds me also. Am I speaking now?
Yes.
Yes. we hear you.
Well, again, I mean, there are lots of similarities here. The word for menstruation in Chewong is "don't want meat." So, but on the other hand, you know, women hardly menstruated because they were either pregnant or had just given birth, and then they got pregnant again. So it wasn't something that happened very often once you were an adult woman.
Yeah.
But meat, of course, is very highly valued, and people go, oh, there hasn't been meat for a long time. Oh gosh, when are the men going to go out and do some hunting and so on? This is sort of common complaints. But meat also was ambivalent because meat is hot, according to Chewong. Blood is hot, meat is hot, and they would say that the reason why we are mortal is that we eat meat, because our alter ego beings that live up above us do not eat meat; they only eat fruit, and they are. So it's a sort of paradox that they were quite aware of. You know, meat is good because it's good. On the other hand, it makes them mortal beings. But when it comes to the current situation of the people who live in the outside of it, or the village on the edge, there are too many people to share. You know, and they will say that you can't share one monkey or one squirrel amongst 50 people. You know, it's an impossibility. So there is to some extent, a bit of secrecy going on here. People would say that the hunter would come back and he would sort of hide what he has caught, but he would share it with his immediate family and perhaps a neighbor or two, but he wouldn't make it a public event as he would have done in the past.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks everybody. I mean, it was so illuminating and it's so educational, getting perspectives from the anthropologists and the historical developments. It's wonderful. Yeah, Li Fang asked this question because in our research, we found, and she has reported, and we probably can share this with you, that there is a marked gender difference between the microbiomes in the Orang Asli compared to other communities. So we are sort of trying to see why this is the case, and could some of this be attributed to different diets and taboos, where in certain communities, and I get, Li Fang, you should share the paper, women are not allowed to eat certain foods to this day, where else men are. So it's just a matter of looking at some fundamental differences. I mean, there's really no way we can actually prove anything at this stage, because we can't actually get thousands and thousands of people and do these controlled studies. But it seems plausible that food taboos might influence this. We're not seeing this gender dichotomy in the microbiome of the saliva. In other, it hasn't been reported really. So hers is one of the few, maybe the only report so far that has indicated this gender difference. And she's investigating, of course, the gut, and then another student is investigating the nasal microbiome. So it's in that light that they were interested in some of these differences. Thank you.
Right. Right. So I just, if I may add, I just want to emphasize that food taboo is just one part of this story, because the other part is the different activities due to resettlement. Like this is a whole new situation for them, and so men partake still in forest collecting, and I think that also could be attributing. So that should be differentiated between like case by case, I guess. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that among Batik, the food taboos that Kirk mentioned, I think they're still in operation, but I do not see a marked difference in gender in terms of diet. But on the other hand, I have taken men away and because I've been studying animals, studying gibbons. And so we go off on our own to the forest, and so we get a lot of meat. The women, I think it's about socioeconomic level. Those who stay in settlements, there's very little hunting sometimes. And also there's, you've got to give game animals population, time for population to recover. So there's going to be, this kind of up and down. So I do not see really a marked difference in what women eat and what men eat.
Mhm.
Okay, well, thanks for that line of questioning. That's a very interesting and important topic. I did see another hand raised. I think Ian Wallace was first. Ian, do you want to turn on your video and ask a question? Ian Wallace? No?
Microphone isn't on.
Great. Sorry, there was a mute
There you
issue.
are, okay.
Hello, thank you so much to all the speakers. It's really interesting. Now all of a sudden I have a new question about the gut microbiome, but I'll save that for another time. I'm really excited to read that paper. I'm just curious, this issue of protein deficiency is fascinating in part because it can have, people have shown that protein deficiency can affect birth weight, and birth weight can have lifelong health effects, including cardiometabolic effects, which we know a lot of Orang Asli communities are now facing cardiometabolic problems. So I'm curious whether or not there is any evidence that these shifts in diets and maybe protein deficiency have been paralleled by changes in birth weight.
I'm sorry, I can't speak to that because I didn't have that kind of data or didn't.
No problem. I was just curious. Okay.
No
Maybe
idea.
they have records at Gomba
Yeah.
that could be used.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, especially when you talk about fertility going up at the same time. There's obviously energetic
Right.
trade-off going on here. So one would assume that any sort of energy limitation, if you're investing more in more kids, there has to be a cost somewhere. And I wouldn't be surprised if birth weight is a cost.
Yeah, that's an interesting and important question as well. And actually, I can recall talking to the doctor in the village, and he did say that Orang Asli children tend to have lower birth rates, but I just didn't, put two together. And but I think it's very much worse to pursue this issue.
Thank you.
Kirk, go ahead if you have a question. Or comment.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the hospital that's been established at Post Labir, but they should have good medical records of birth weights now for the past however many years it's been in existence, because apparently all of the children born in that settlement are born in the hospital now. Somebody could look at those birth records at that hospital.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think there's a lot of potential to use health records like that and link it with other environmental factors that could help answer questions like Ian's talking about. Okay, we have a few more questions and comments. There was some nice debate and discussion in the chat box earlier about gender differences of sedentization. This is kind of a big topic, and each of the speakers today kind of referenced this. A lot of people in the chat box had their own experiences to share or observations. Maybe I can just open it up if anyone wants to chime in and give their thoughts.
This will be saved along with the rest of the session.
Yep, this will be saved and we'll put it up on a website and also on YouTube in the next day or two.
Okay.
Okay, so if no one's chiming in on that, we have a question from Isabella. It's kind of a long question, and I think maybe Isabella might want to introduce herself and read it out. Isabella, do you want to turn on your video and ask this very interesting question, which relates to something that is affecting everyone right now?
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Isabella. I'm currently doing a master program at the ANU. So I recently reading and compiling a lot of articles about the impact of the current pandemic to indigenous peoples. And like many other groups, like for example, in the Amazon, one of the responses is to flee deep back into the forest. I think Kirk also mentioned this for the measles epidemic in Orang Asli group, and I was wondering how is the condition today in Orang Asli? How is the situation for the current pandemic, and is it still a viable option for them to flee to deep into the jungle? I mean, considering I guess the diminishing forest and also the resources like how to find food, etc. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I can answer that. With regard to the Chewang, I think I mentioned it very briefly, is that as long as the Crown Game Reserve is accepted and respected by the authorities, there's sufficient amount of forest, wild forest, primary forest, for Chewang to run and hide if they want to do so. And they do so from time to time. Although the distances aren't enormous, but as you all know, outsiders are quite reluctant to go into the forest. They are fairly sort of anxious about being there. And they would certainly, so far, I've never known anybody pursuing anybody into the forest. But I mean, why would they want to flee? They flee because they're frightened, not really because they perform some ghastly act that the police would be interested in. But yes, they can flee, they can hide. And that is, I think, their immediate instinct. Do they feel fear of some kind?
Is it also still the case for the people who are already resettled right now?
The people who are what?
Resettled, like living in settlements, for example. So they just like leave their like houses and just go back to the forest. Is it?
They can, because it's all their family living in there. You know, everybody knows each other very, very well. Contact is maintained all the time. Gossip is maintained all the time. There's certainly places to run where they would, if they should wish to do so, yes.
I heard from people like Colin Nicholas that when this epidemic hit the Batek in the upper Levere River in 2019, one response by some of the people was to go into the national park and stay in there, isolated as best they could. And others of you who've been there more recently than I have can say whether that's correct or not. That response seems to echo what they were doing clear back in 1971 when they contracted a disease that seemed to come from an outside source.
Well, so I don't know anything about the pandemic and their reactions to the pandemic, but I don't see any reason why that would not also be possible for a good reason for some people to withdraw, but I don't know.
Yeah.
You want to chime in? Yeah.
They fled into the forest and at the behest of the health workers, actually. The ones in Pahang anyway. The health workers told them, just go back to the forest.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Like there's one case where she said, it was told to me that the health worker was standing there in the settlement with a motorbike, watching the batik walk into the forest. That was I think Colin also said that it was a more general phenomenon.
We should say that the Batek do have Taman Negara, the national park, as available, similarly to the Chewang having a game reserve available to them. Other groups don't have that advantage, as Csilla was mentioning for the Llano. There is no forest left for them to escape into.
Right. Yeah. I just would like to mention that the Llano were resettled in Iowa in 1980s, but actually the first attempt to resettle Llano occurred in the 1960s in another location, and that plan actually completely failed because of a cholera epidemic. And people mentioned that several people died every day. And so the response then was just to scatter, like in twos and threes, to the traditional area. And from the way people talked about this, it was also clear that it was not just running away from the epidemic or instinctively feeling that it's not good to be grouped together, but going back to their traditional places. For instance, the Llano had a very important spiritual connection to the caves near Langong. And so that was sort of a healing aspect to running back to their traditional land and these places as well. And so again, it's, yeah.
I seriously wonder how many younger Temias could survive in the forest now. Would they know how to? They've had virtually no experience or practice of that way of living. So, I mean, Temias, of course, are differently organized from many other communities. Bataks obviously have retained their knowledge of how to survive in the forest, but some Temias might, but I think the majority probably would find it very difficult.
Okay, thanks for that. Really interesting perspectives. I realized I missed a comment earlier by Ita Banan, who wants to share some information about the previous thing we just talked about, taboo practices in her community when women cannot eat meat when they have their period every month. Do you want to chime in with a comment or an experience? Thanks.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for this opportunity and also for giving me this platform to share. Actually, yeah, I'm also from Signe tribe. Actually, regards to taboo practice, still practice until today is under among the community, Signe community in interior area and also Jahai, where among women they cannot eat meat when they have having period every month. At the same time, they also cannot have, if they only eat rice and also vegetables with the selected vegetables. For example, during for the vegetables, they only they cannot eat, take a bamboo shoots, and also they only can have all green vegetables with rice. And some women in our community, especially Signe, they only having tea without sugar, and I think they really lack of a protein when that month they're having a period. So this is when, so sometimes I also asking because for me, hello, everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I also got asked their opinions. Why they still practice all these things? Because they said if they're having a meat or taking a vegetable, they're supposed cannot take during that period. When they go to jungle, something bad will happen to them. For example, when they go to their own go to the jungle to get something or to harvest things, probably they will set tiger or will attack them or something bad will happen to them. So this is what they believe, and that's why when we go to the village and something when they're having a period, normally they will say, sorry, we cannot have this. So sometimes they will bring their own plate and then they will sitting at the back. So this is still practicing among in our community, in my community. Yeah.
Aita, do you know, are there other communities, other Semai communities where that is no longer practiced, or as far as you know, is that still widespread amongst all the Semai communities you're familiar with?
Okay, so actually, because when I'm thinking about Semai, actually I'm also from a Semai tribe. When I'm small, my grandparents always said when having a period, you cannot have meat. So they already list down what kind of meat that I cannot have. For example, wabao, meat, some like monkey, something like that. And then so actually when I grow up and also exposed with I go out from my village. So like I'm study and I meet with different people. So I'm try to take when I having a period, and I try to take like for example something that I cannot take, but actually nothing happened to me. Yeah, this is nothing happened to me. Then I feel if this I'm because I'm when I do all these things, I'm not in the village. So that's sometimes they believe and also whatever the traditional told by the parents or great grandparents. So this is they carry until the next generation. So, but when I am in the village, I didn't dare to say they cannot practice, because I think this is also part of their cultures. So, just like I'm wondering how they can get or change the protein. For example, if they cannot eat the monkey or wild boar, so maybe they can replace like chicken or fish, something like that. So I think in this stage maybe need some exposure, but maybe take time. But I understand sometimes when in jungle, anything can be happen to them, right? For example, they got told me the story. Last time got one lady when having a period, so she take a bamboo shoot. So when at night, I don't know how this lady appeared, that they said she already passed away, and they found her body in the jungle with a very, I think it's not good conditions. They said is where tiger attack her. So I see this is also some of them related.
Okay.
Looks like
It seems we may have lost Aita. Give her one more minute.
Can I just add something to this?
Sure.
About the possibility of replacing wild meat with domestic meat, for instance, chicken. I completely forgot about this, and I think it's relevant and it's interesting that Alano had chicken. They raised chicken. Chicken were running around, but they never ate them because they said that eating animals that you raise yourself is like eating your own children. So they would never ever touch domestic animals, and so that was not an option at all to replace. Yeah, chicken were mostly just eaten by foxes, and or they were sometimes sold, but never eaten by the people. Yeah.
That reminds me. I think it was in 1981. Somebody from the Department of Orang Asli Affairs decided it'd be a good idea for the people around Post Labir to have cows and to learn to take care of them and milk them and do the things you do with cows. The cows overran their crops, and the Batak didn't want to either eat them or drink the milk, and they finally sold them to some outsiders.
Right. Yeah. The same thing happened in Alba before I got there. The jail introduced some goats to raise, but the goats were just gone, eaten by animals, wild animals, or maybe sold, and they were of course scolded that they can't take care of the goats. But yeah.
I should add that this distinction between pets, which you shouldn't eat, and wild animals, which you can eat, wasn't quite that simple with the Batek, because they sometimes captured baby animals when the mother was killed. Could be a hornbill or a monkey mother or whatever. And they would keep the baby for a few days and then it would die and then they would eat it. So
Oh, I see. Okay.
it was
Yeah.
not long enough in the family to be considered part of the family.
Right, exactly. So the emphasis on raising the
Raising,
little animal yourself. Yeah, yeah. No.
Just to come back to some of the comments that were raised about the pandemic, a few people have noted the need to maintain blockades to defend ancestral lands. Does someone want to chime in and explain this in a little more depth? I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about this.
Sorry,
Maybe Andy or Zanisa or Waitopo, anyone?
what did you say? Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, I was noting that people in the chat had discussed how some communities are hesitant to flee into the forest because they need to maintain their blockades against logging, protecting their land. Does anyone have any experience with this? I might want to share something.
That came from Andy.
Maybe Andy or Zanisa.
Hi, Vivek.
Oh, hi there.
Yeah, I've had a little experience of that with the Temyar near sort of the Betis area and surrounding area. There has been thoughts where they wanted to get away from the pandemic, but a number of them have blockades that are repeated, bulldozed down by logging company representatives. And many of them that spend a lot of time trying to find ways to peacefully protect their ancestral lands are of the mind that not that the pandemic is invented, but that the logging companies themselves are using it as cover to go and encroach on more of the Temyar land. So they have cited to me that's one reason why they wouldn't want to go deeper into the forest, and do try to maintain a presence. Colin would probably know a lot more about this than myself.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Colin, your microphone's not on.
Okay, maybe we'll just move on then. Okay, so it's about 10:40 now. Are there any final questions, any burning questions that people would like to ask our speakers today?
Can you explain?
Oh, Colin is saying the e-host needs to unmute me.
Yeah, I've just unmuted him. He should be able to talk.
Yeah.
So, okay, sorry about that, Colin.
Okay, the question is, okay, sorry, this baby here, Uni. Lily, what is this? Yeah, so the question was the Orang Asli were fleeing during the pandemic, fleeing during the MCO. The correct word to use is not flee, but retreating. Some of the communities were retreated into the forest as what some of you all has mentioned about the way of reacting to these kind of issues. Not fleeing, but retreating. And to reply to what Kirk mentioned, it's not only Orang Asli who are living close to the Taman Negara or the Cloud Wildlife Reserve that have access to forests. Many Orang Asli still have access to forests. Smugburi, for example, in Ulu Bandol area, they have done it. And I've seen pictures sent to us by groups for Jahais, for example, in Selao, in Smugburi people and so on, where whole families, groups of families went into the villages, went into the forest and lived there for about a month, not so long, about a month, with the kids and everything else. And subsistence there was much, much better.
So it was an escape in some sense. But as people also mentioned, one of the first things many Orang Asli villages did was to blockade or barricade their villages, even before the Juli Ido gave the instruction that no outsiders were to enter the Orang Asli areas during the first MCO in April, March, April. But the sad thing is that everybody has let down their guard now, and many outsiders, many non-Orang Asli are entering to Orang Asli kampongs, some of them with 40 four-wheel drive vehicles, and posing a risk to Orang Asli. Now, if one person in Orang Asli village is infected with the COVID-19 virus, you can imagine how fast it will spread within the community, given their way of life. So that's where the issue is now, where people have let down their guard, and given that we have another third wave, or very disastrous third wave now, I think people who are entering Orang Asli villages now should be extra careful. That's all.
Thanks, Colin. That's some good and interesting points there. We do have one last question. Li Fang is asking, have other people noticed that the Orang Asli have grown taller over the years? There's a suggestion that it may be changes to the gut microbiome. Of course, better nutrition may also be a large factor. That does seem to be a theme that we've heard in these discussions. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I can certainly confirm that, and it's not just Orang Asli. When I first started teaching at the old University of Singapore, I was taller than all the students. Now they're all taller than me. So it's not just Orang Asli. But yes, I have noticed it amongst the Orang Asli for sure. Yeah.
Good, interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, that seems to be the general sort of consensus, with perhaps a variety of factors leading toward that result. We should probably wrap things up. I think this final question from, I'll definitely butcher this name, Mohammed Wayu Diensaya, asks, from what I capture from this discussion, sedentization has led to less mobile Orang Asli, some even becoming more obese. Does that mean they're better off in the forest rather than in villages? And if resettlement has deprived access of the Orang Asli to forest or led to less dependency on forest resources, would that mean that resettlement has made them less resilient, particularly in times of crisis such as the pandemic? And it seems like, based on this discussion, that the answer seems to be probably yes. Does anyone want to kind of wrap this up by providing further comments on that? Does anyone disagree?
I think that's a huge subject, but generally the answer is yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is maybe something we can continue to talk about over the next few webinars, of course. So we've gone basically an hour over the anticipated time, but this has been...
Kirk seems like he wanted to respond to that.
Oh, sorry. Kirk, go ahead.
This is a more technical question. I haven't been able to follow all the chat because I've been watching and listening to people's presentations. After we close, can we get back and communicate with people somehow to answer their questions, or will we be able to look at the chat later?
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe Rodney, you can help out here. But what I'll just say is that the chat is going to be archived. You can do that on your own, but we will also do that. And I think it will come along with the video that we post. So you will have access to this. As far as getting people connected to each other, I know that Rodney has everyone's emails based on registration associated with names, but we'll need to think about a way to do that if you wanted to respond to someone in more detail. Tom or Rodney, do you have any comments on how that might work?
Not entirely sure how we're going to do that, but we will. So I'll promise Vivek will share sort of our approach to that shortly. So, but yes, Kurt.
Yeah.
Thank you. I see at the bottom, there's something that says file. Maybe I can file this whole
Yeah.
chat.
The 3 dots and then you'll save.
Yeah, so Tom is saying that is correct if you wanted to do that, and we'll also be doing it as well.
Yeah,
If you want to follow along in real time in the future, Kirk, the chat bar is at the very bottom. You just press chat and it pops up on the right-hand side.
Oh, I've seen it. I just haven't had time to read it.
Okay, yeah. Gotcha. It does move fast. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for participating. I think this has been a success. It's really good to see many of you again, and also to see lots of new faces. So we'll be meeting at the same time next Tuesday. And we look forward to seeing everybody again. If there's any questions in the meantime or comments, feel free to email me, and we look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, I'd just say
Thank you,
you.
Vivek.
It's really great to see so many people coming out for this. This has exceeded expectations, and it's really nice to see some crosstalk between people working on sort of the biological side and the cultural side of these issues. So really, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
So we're going to
you.
close up the chat room in a moment. Thanks, Rodney.
Thanks to all the speakers.
Thank you. It was good to see you all.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next week.
Okay, and Rodney, I think you can go ahead and close down the session.
Okay.